The air inside the federal courtroom felt too still, like even the walls were holding their breath. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, casting a sterile glare across the polished wood of the bench and the rigid faces lining the gallery. Every eye in the room was trained on Major Blake Turner, seated stiffly at the defense table. His hands were folded tightly in his lap, though they betrayed his tension with the slightest tremble in his knuckles. To his left, lying quietly and alert, was Diesel. The German Shepherd was more than just a dog. He was a soldier, trained, tested, and hardened by the same war that had nearly broken Blake. They had served side by side in Afghanistan, clearing compounds and walking point through villages where one wrong step meant death. Diesel had pulled Blake from wreckage once, bleeding and half-conscious, after an IED buried half their convoy. Now, years later, the dog sat quietly by his side again, sensing the weight in the room even without, understanding its human meaning. Blake's trial had dragged on for 6 long weeks. The prosecution had painted him as a whistleblower gone rogue, accusing him of leaking classified intelligence to expose the mishandling of a covert mission. The documents had found their way to a journalist, and while Blake never admitted how, he never denied trying to protect his men from being sent to die for a lie. None of that mattered now. The jury had found him guilty of unauthorized disclosure of military intelligence. The sentence would come today. Diesel shifted slightly, his amber eyes watching the judge's bench. He hadn't moved all morning. Even when the courtroom doors creaked open and closed with people coming and going, he had stayed perfectly still, like a soldier on watch. Blake reached down and rested his fingers on Diesel's back. The fur was coarse, but familiar, solid. His chest rose and fell steadily, a quiet presence in the noise of Blake's thoughts. The touch steadied him more than anything else could have. The judge entered, robe trailing behind him like smoke. He settled into his chair and looked across the courtroom, his eyes hard, unreadable. He tapped the gavel once, more for show than need. The room was already silent. "Major Blake Turner," he began, his voice echoing against the oak-paneled walls, "you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 3 counts of unlawful disclosure of classified material." Blake's jaw tightened. He didn't glance at the gallery behind him. He didn't look for sympathy. Most of the seats were filled with reporters, a few unfamiliar military faces, and one older woman clutching a small American flag folded into a triangle. Someone's mother, maybe someone from his unit. Diesel let out a low breath, his nose twitching as if he sensed something wasn't right. "You served your country with distinction for over a decade," the judge continued. "No one in this room doubts your bravery, Major, but bravery does not place you above the law." Blake swallowed the burn behind his teeth. Diesel shifted again, just slightly, but his body had stiffened. His ears twitched. "I am prepared to deliver sentencing," the judge said, his hand moving toward the file in front of him, "unless there is a final statement or request." Blake glanced down at Diesel and raised his hand slightly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "before sentencing I'd like to request a moment, just a minute, to say goodbye." The judge hesitated. The bailiff looked toward the bench for guidance. A long pause stretched between them. "1 minute," the judge said. "Make it brief." Blake stood slowly, his uniform creaking at the shoulders. Diesel rose with him, eyes locked forward. Blake knelt beside the dog, placing a hand on his scruff and another on his chest. "Good boy," he whispered. "Always were, weren't you?" Diesel's ears perked. His body tensed, not from emotion, not from the softness of farewell, but from something else, something alert, focused. His eyes snapped past Blake's shoulder toward the gallery. Then the growl started, low, rumbling, almost inaudible. But Blake heard it. He knew that sound. It wasn't just a dog reacting. It wasn't fear or confusion. It was warning. And Diesel wasn't looking at Blake anymore. He was staring straight ahead, muscles coiled, gaze fixed. Blake turned to follow the line of his partner's sight, and in that moment, before the gavel could fall, before the sentence could be spoken, everything shifted. Something was wrong, and Diesel was the only one who knew. Blake's hand hovered just beneath Diesel's collar, his thumb grazing the edge of the dog's metal tag. He hadn't spoken in a while, hadn't needed to. They never were the kind of team that needed many words. War had a way of burning language down to the essentials, and right now all Blake had left was a soft thank you and a goodbye. He couldn't quite shape into anything more than a breath. Then Diesel's body locked beneath his palm. Not a tremble, not a nervous flinch. Rigid, alert. Blake froze. He felt it through his fingers first, tightened muscle beneath fur, the sudden tension that came not from fear, but from focus. Diesel wasn't saying goodbye. He wasn't even listening to Blake anymore. His head tilted slightly, ears pivoting forward. The growl came low and deep, rumbling from his chest like a distant engine warming up before takeoff. Controlled, measured, purposeful. Blake's heart stuttered. That sound, he knew it. He hadn't heard it in years, but it lived in the recesses of his memory like a flare buried just under the surface. He remembered the first time it saved his life. A dark room in a remote village. The bomb was wired under a floorboard. Diesel had growled just like that, barely loud enough to register, but enough for Blake to stop, to think, to survive. And now, here it was again, in a sterile courtroom lit with buzzing lights and surrounded by murmuring strangers. Diesel's eyes were fixed beyond Blake, locked like a laser across the room. Not on the judge, not on the bailiffs. No, it was someone in the gallery, fourth row back. A man sitting still, maybe too still, with one hand tucked tight beneath his coat. Blake rose slowly from his knee, his mind tearing through possibilities with the clarity that came only in combat zones. Diesel didn't growl without reason, and Diesel never got it wrong. The judge noticed the dog's change in behavior and paused mid-sentence. "Is something the matter, Major Turner?" he asked, voice tight, watching Diesel now with guarded eyes. Blake didn't answer. He stepped to the side, between Diesel and the man in the fourth row, shielding the dog's line of sight as if testing to confirm what he already suspected. Diesel growled, again, louder this time. His stance was firm now, front paw forward, weight distributed, the way he had done every time he signaled danger on patrol. The gallery was quieting. A few people leaned forward. A few glanced around, confused. One woman clutched her purse a little tighter. "Your Honor," Blake said, his voice suddenly clear and loud, "I think my dog's trying to tell us something." The bailiff moved forward, tentative, hand resting on the butt of his holstered weapon. "Sir, you need to return to your seat." But Diesel barked then, not aggressively, not wildly, but one sharp, commanding burst that echoed off the courtroom walls and made half the room jolt. Then came the sound of a chair scraping. The man in the fourth row stood up, too fast, too sudden. Blake's instincts roared. He stepped forward just as Diesel lunged. Not to attack, but to intercept. The man reached under his coat, and suddenly a dull metallic glint appeared. A small black object, no bigger than a canister, but with a blinking light. Someone screamed. Blake tackled the man just as Diesel clamped his jaw on the man's arm, locking down hard and dragging him sideways. The device hit the ground and rolled straight down the center aisle. Gasps turned to chaos. Bailiffs charged forward. Someone shouted, "Get back!" Another voice, probably the judge, called for evacuation. Blake didn't move. His knee pinned the man's chest as Diesel held tight. The suspect groaned, fighting to get free, but Diesel was relentless. It took less than 30 seconds. But in the time between Diesel's first growl and the final lurch of the suspect being cuffed and dragged out, everything had changed. Blake stood there breathing hard, sweat running down the side of his face. He looked at Diesel, who now sat beside him again, tail still, chest rising and falling like nothing had happened. "You saw it," Blake whispered, crouching beside him again. "You knew." Diesel didn't respond. He didn't have to. Outside the courtroom, emergency units arrived. Bomb squad, sniffer teams. The blinking device was confirmed as a makeshift explosive, low yield, but powerful, enough to cause casualties. Inside, the judge hadn't resumed his seat. He stood behind the bench, arms folded, watching the veteran and the dog who had just stopped something no one else had seen coming. And Blake, for the first time in weeks, finally did. But not because the verdict was postponed, not because his sentence might change. He exhaled because the growl had come, because Diesel remembered who he was, and because when it mattered most, he hadn't just saved Blake's life. He'd saved everyone else's too. The courtroom exploded into confusion. Chairs scraped back, someone screamed. A gavel slammed once, twice, but it couldn't compete with the sound of Diesel's paws pounding against the polished floor. He had broken from Blake's side with a sudden burst of speed, a blur of muscle and purpose, bolting across the room like he had done 100 times in war zones. But this wasn't a battlefield. It was a courtroom. Still, Diesel didn't seem to care. The gallery lurched back as the dog tore past them, ignoring the startled gasps, and the bailiff shouting orders that no one could hear over the pounding in their chests. The judge rose behind the bench, eyes wide, robe fluttering slightly as he leaned forward. "Restrain the dog," someone shouted. A second voice barked, "Get him under control now." But Diesel didn't slow. He didn't attack a witness. He didn't lunge at anyone in the crowd. His path was straight, clean, intentional, toward the far end of the courtroom, beside the jury box, where a grey trash bin sat mostly unnoticed against the panelled wall. He skidded to a halt in front of it, claws clicking sharply against tile, and began barking, loud, fierce, not out of fear or aggression, but with urgency, controlled urgency. That sound again, the one Blake hadn't heard since their deployment overseas, the bark that meant something was there, something dangerous. Blake didn't move at first. His brain was still catching up, but Diesel had never, not once, reacted like this without reason. Not in a field, not in a hallway, not during the worst of it when they swept buildings side by side. So when Blake finally stood, the gavel still hammering in the background, he didn't flinch from the chaos. He moved toward it. The lead bailiff had his hand on his weapon but wasn't sure what to do. "Get the dog back," he yelled. "Get him away from the gallery." "No," Blake said, his voice cutting through the noise, low but steady. "You need to trust him." "Major Turner," the judge barked, clearly struggling to keep control. "Call off your dog, or this courtroom will be cleared." Blake raised a hand toward Diesel but didn't say a word. Instead, he turned toward the judge and said, "Permission to check what he's alerting on." The judge hesitated. There was something about the way Blake stood, calm amid the chaos, like this wasn't new to him. Like war had trained him to read the world in ways no courtroom protocol ever could. The judge gave a curt nod. "Proceed, carefully." Blake walked toward the trash bin slowly, Diesel still barking beside it, his nose pressed against the plastic lid now, his tail stiff. Every movement of the dog's body was tense and deliberate, like a coiled spring. Blake crouched beside him, "What is it, boy?" Diesel backed away just enough to let Blake step forward, then let out one more bark, sharp and quick, then fell silent. Blake lifted the lid of the bin slowly. Nothing obvious at first. Just crumpled paper, a few plastic bottles, a half-eaten sandwich in foil. But then he saw it, a black nylon pouch, zipped shut and shoved low behind the waist. It looked ordinary, but Blake had seen those before, overseas, in barracks, in back alleys. They never held anything good. He didn't touch it. Instead, he turned toward the bailiff. "Get the bomb squad, now!" The silence that followed was immediate and suffocating. "What?" one of the court officers asked. Blake stood, eyes never leaving the bin. "There's something here, something that doesn't belong." Within seconds, the courtroom erupted again, but this time into movement. The judge ordered an evacuation. The jury was escorted out. People ran, others froze. The once formal space collapsed into adrenaline-fueled survival. Blake stood his ground. Diesel stood beside him. 10 minutes later, bomb squad arrived. The room had been cleared, but Blake and Diesel remained just outside, behind a barrier. They watched as the black nylon pouch was carefully extracted and scanned. The lead technician gave a quiet nod. "Crude device," he said. "Homemade. Would have hurt people, that's for sure." Blake didn't respond. He just looked down at Diesel, who now sat calmly, tail brushing the floor in slow, easy sweeps. He knelt beside him. "You didn't just sense it," Blake whispered. "You stopped it." Diesel nudged his shoulder with his nose, then looked away as if the job was done, and he didn't need thanks. But Blake knew better. He reached up and scratched just behind Diesel's ear, the place he always liked, best, and let out a slow, grateful breath. Some people say dogs can't tell when something's wrong. They've never met Diesel. At first, no one moved. The shouting had stopped. The gavel was silent. All eyes locked on the dog sitting in front of the trash bin, as if the entire room had paused to take a breath it couldn't quite release. Diesel didn't bark again, not right away. He just stared at the bin with unblinking intensity, his body locked in place like a statue. The low growl rumbling from his chest was deep and deliberate, a warning from something ancient and instinctive. He wasn't bluffing. He never had. Blake stood slowly at the defense table. He didn't ask for permission this time. He didn't look at the judge or the bailiffs. His eyes were on Diesel, and that growl, a sound he had once heard in a desert compound moments before a buried explosive was found, told him everything. "He's signaling," Blake said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "There's something in that bin." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the back gasped. The lead bailiff moved toward Diesel cautiously, hand still resting on the grip of his weapon, unsure whether to treat the dog like a threat or a savior. "Major Turner," the judge said, voice lower now, almost grave. "Do you have reason to believe this is an actual threat?" Blake didn't look away from Diesel. "That dog's been on more combat tours than anyone in this room. He doesn't growl for no reason. He doesn't sit unless he's not confirming. He's trained for detection. I trust him more than I trust my own eyes." Another bark exploded from Diesel, loud and sharp. Then another. He turned in a tight circle around the bin, nose to the floor, tail stiff and raised. Then he sat again, this time curling his lip ever so slightly, teeth flashing in a silent snarl. "He's certain," Blake said. "Whatever's in there, it's dangerous." The judge's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the microphone on his bench. "Clear the courtroom," he ordered, the authority in his voice returning. "Now." Panic didn't hit like a wave. It hit like a punch. The gallery erupted into movement, people pushing back benches and chairs, voices overlapping as officers herded them toward the exits. The jury was rushed out a side door, the court clerk's papers forgotten on the desk, but Blake remained where he was, watching Diesel, who hadn't budged an inch. Blake took a cautious step forward. "Easy, boy," he said gently. "I'm coming to you." The bailiff tried to intercept, but the judge held up a hand. "Let him go." Blake approached slowly, hands open, not wanting to startle the dog or distract him. Diesel's ears twitched, but he stayed focused, his eyes still locked on the bin. As Blake neared, he crouched beside him, placing a steady hand on Diesel's shoulder. "You smell it, don't you?" he whispered. "You've smelled it before." Diesel's head tilted slightly, just enough to acknowledge him, before resuming that laser-focused stare. Blake knew this pattern. It was classic detection behavior. There was no confusion in it, no hesitation. It was as if every hour of training, every mission, every moment of trust between them had led to this second. A second that had just saved lives. The bomb squad wasn't far behind. Their heavy steps echoed down the hallway as the unit arrived in full gear. Officers cleared a wider perimeter, dragging benches aside, taping off the area around the bin. One technician eyed Blake and Diesel before crouching to examine the trash can with gloved hands. A beat passed, then another, and then the technician stood, eyes wide. "There's a device," he said. The judge inhaled sharply, frozen at his bench. "A real device. Looks like a makeshift IED. Crude, but enough to hurt a lot of people if it had gone off." Silence fell again. Blake let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. His hand slid across Diesel's back, a silent thank you to the dog who hadn't hesitated. Diesel didn't react. He didn't need praise. He just sat there, silent, watching, like he had done on night patrols through bomb-riddled alleyways, trusting his instincts over human noise. The courtroom was quiet now, emptied of voices but full of something heavier. Awe, fear, gratitude. Blake stood and looked down at Diesel, who finally broke his gaze from the bin and looked up at his partner. Their eyes met, and for a flicker of a moment, something passed between them, unspoken but understood. No medal, no ribbon, no verdict in the world could explain it. Some heroes don't speak. They listen, they feel, they know. And today, Diesel knew before anyone else. The ticking silence that followed the technician's words was heavier than any explosion. It clung to the air, thick and electric, wrapping itself around the room like invisible smoke. Every breath felt borrowed now, each heartbeat a reminder of what could have been. Diesel remained motionless by the bin, his eyes sharp, body still, but Blake could see the faint tremble in the dog's chest. Not fear, focus. It was the same steady rhythm he'd seen during night raids, when every corner might have held danger and only instinct kept them alive. The bomb squad lead stepped closer, kneeling beside the technician already, examining the contents of the trash bin. One by one, they began pulling out innocuous-looking debris. Paper cups, crumpled notepads, a snapped pen. It looked like nothing. But underneath, wrapped in black tape and stuffed inside the false bottom of the bin, was something much darker. The technician didn't say anything at first. He just looked up and gave a small, sharp nod. That was all it took. "It's real," the squad lead said grimly, standing up and turning to the judge, who was still frozen at his bench. "A remote detonated IED, crude but effective. If it had gone off in this room." He glanced around at the scattered benches, the empty jury box, the clerk's station. "We'd be calling families right now." The judge swallowed hard. He sat back in his chair, the weight of what had nearly happened settling into the lines of his face. His gavel rested inches from his hand, untouched since Diesel's warning. "How close were we?" he asked quietly. The technician looked down at the device again. "Seconds, maybe. Could have been triggered at any moment." Blake felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. He looked around the courtroom, the scattered papers, the marks on the floor where people had bolted in panic. Then back at Diesel. The dog had moved slightly, now resting in a low crouch, but his eyes were still locked on the bin. It wasn't over yet, not in his mind. The bomb squad began securing the device, methodically disarming and packaging it. One wrong move, and it could still ignite. But Diesel had already made the right one. Blake knelt beside his partner again. He didn't say anything at first, just placed a hand on Diesel's shoulder. The muscle beneath the fur was taut, the dog still riding, that razor edge between duty and instinct. "You did good," Blake whispered. "You saved everyone in this room." Diesel finally shifted his gaze, just for a moment, meeting Blake's eyes. It was brief, but it was there. Connection, trust, and something even deeper. Not pride, not recognition, just certainty. This is what he was meant to do. Court security was everywhere now, sweeping the entire building. Every hallway, every chamber, every room was being combed through with fresh eyes and tight hands on holsters. Someone had brought that bomb in. Someone had intended for this courtroom to become a memory, and if not for Diesel, it would have been. The judge stood, finally. His robe looked heavier on his shoulders now. He looked down at Blake. "Major Turner," he said, voice low, "I owe you, and that dog, a debt we can never repay." Blake stood, straightening slowly. "Don't owe me," he said. He saw it before anyone else. He knew. The judge nodded and glanced toward Diesel. "If he hadn't—" "But he did," Blake cut in gently. "That's what matters." The technician approached the bench, cradling the now safe device in a protective dot case. "We'll have our report within the hour. We're notifying federal authorities. This was no accident." The judge nodded. "Understood." Then he turned back to Blake. "We'll reconvene once the building is secure. Until then, you and your partner, rest." Blake didn't argue. He clipped Diesel's leash back on, though the dog didn't resist. They walked toward the doors of the courtroom together, the only ones remaining, now in the fading noise. As they stepped into the hallway, Blake felt it. Not just the adrenaline draining from his body, but something else. Relief. Not that he was spared, but that Diesel had remembered what they were, what they did, who they still were, even here, far from the sand and noise of battle. Blake looked down at him. "You never forgot, did you?" Diesel didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Sometimes the loudest alarms come from silence, and this time that silence had saved them all. Outside, the courthouse steps buzzed with confusion and urgency, a controlled chaos, unfolding under the harsh glare of television lights and red-blue strobes. Reporters shoved microphones toward anyone in uniform. Spectators clung to each other, replaying the moment in hushed disbelief. But Blake Turner stood still, one hand resting on Diesel's harness, the other clenched at his side. He watched it all with the detachment of a man who had seen far worse in places no one remembered, and yet today rattled him. This wasn't war. This was supposed to be justice. A courtroom, a place where truth stood taller than tactics. And someone had tried to turn it into a graveyard. Diesel sat calmly at his side, eyes scanning every movement like a machine finely tuned for threat. He didn't wag his tail. He didn't seek praise. The dog remained on duty, even with the danger gone, because something deeper than instinct told him it wasn't over yet. The bomb squad worked behind the yellow tape, pulling debris from the bin and collecting forensic samples. One of the techs gave Blake a nod of recognition as he passed, murmuring, "Your dog's a damn hero." Blake only nodded in return. Hero didn't even begin to cover it. Near the bottom of the courthouse steps, a podium had been hastily set up. A suited official from the Department of Homeland Security took to the mic, his voice steady, camera-friendly. What occurred today was nearly a national tragedy. Thanks to the vigilance of a trained service dog and the immediate response of our bomb squad, lives were saved. We owe our gratitude to Major Blake Turner and his canine partner, Diesel. The crowd clapped. Flashes popped. Diesel didn't move. Blake's eyes flicked toward the front entrance. Court had been evacuated quickly, but not neatly. The gallery was cleared in minutes. Judges, clerks, attorneys, everyone pushed out like a tide pulled by fear. But Blake had seen something before the blast. Doors shut. A figure slipping through a side hallway, not running, not panicked. Calm. Too calm. He didn't have proof. Just instinct. And when Diesel looked in that direction too, ears forward, nose in the air, Blake knew he wasn't imagining it. Someone had planted that bomb with precision. Someone who knew the layout. Someone who timed it perfectly just before the verdict. Not an attack on random people, but a message. Silence the verdict, and you silence the truth. A young woman from the local news tried to get close, voice raised above the noise. "Major Turner, what went through your mind when Diesel reacted?" Blake didn't answer, not because he didn't want to, but because the question missed the point. What mattered wasn't what went through his mind. It was what went through Diesel's. The war dog hadn't hesitated. He'd sensed it before any metal detector, any scan, any trained eye. He'd read the room like a battlefield, and Blake knew that kind of awareness didn't come from training alone. It came from experience, from surviving enough explosions that even the stillness of a room could scream danger. Blake crouched beside him now, brushing a hand over Diesel's back. His fur was coarse, dusted from the courtroom floor. "You saw what no one else did," he murmured. Diesel didn't look at him. He was still watching that hallway, still listening. The agents wrapped the device and carried it to a secure vehicle. Blake stood as the judge approached, flanked by two federal officers. The older man's face was pale, his hands still trembling slightly. "I want to speak to you and your dog," he said. "Privately. There's more here, and I think we both know it." Blake nodded once. "Yeah," he said. "I think someone wanted us quiet." The judge didn't argue. In a quiet side room, now cleared and guarded, Blake and the judge sat while an agent reviewed early findings. The explosive had been military grade, too clean, too deliberate. No fingerprints. No camera caught anyone near the bin, and the most damning detail, the judge's name had been found on a folded note buried beneath the liner. Blake stared at it in silence. This wasn't a statement. It was a warning. Diesel sat across from him, still alert, still ready. "They tried to erase everything with one blast," the judge said softly. "The verdict, the record, me." Blake met his eyes. "They didn't count on him." The judge looked at Diesel. "Then let's make sure we don't waste what he stopped." Blake rose, knowing this was no longer about one trial. It was bigger, and whatever Diesel had sensed, it was part of something that hadn't ended, just paused. Outside, the cameras waited. The public would call it a miracle. But Blake knew better. It wasn't a miracle. It was a warning, and Diesel had been the only one who listened. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as agents and courthouse staff huddled around the playback monitor in the security office. The grainy footage paused, then rolled back. Again, slowed, frame by frame. There, at the edge of the gallery, A man in a grey jacket, head low, slipping through the crowd moments before. Diesel had broken away from Blake. No one had noticed him in the chaos. He hadn't run. He hadn't shouted. He had simply disappeared, quiet as smoke. Blake leaned forward, his jaw set. His eyes didn't blink. One of the Homeland agents hit pause and pointed to the screen. "That's not a public exit," she said. "That hallway leads to judges' chambers and secured evidence rooms. It requires clearance." The judge stood in the corner, arms crossed, his face ashen. "Only 7 people had access to that level today," he muttered. "All vetted. Staff we've worked with for years." Blake didn't answer. He was watching Diesel. The dog had been pacing the room since they entered, nose to the floor, then the air. His movements were sharp, focused, a rhythm Blake had seen before, on missions, before the first shot rang out. When something didn't add up, Diesel's entire posture changed. And now, as one of the agents pulled a Ziploc bag from a locker and set it on the table, a broken piece of a plastic ID badge charred along the edge, Diesel froze. His ears twitched. He sniffed once, twice. Then a low growl rumbled from his chest. It wasn't rage, it was recognition. Blake took a breath. He knows that scent. The agent opened the bag carefully, extending it toward Diesel. The dog didn't move for a heartbeat, then stepped forward, nose twitching with precision. Another growl, this one deeper. Blake stepped in beside him, one hand resting gently behind Diesel's shoulders. "It's someone he's worked near before," he said. "Someone inside." The judge rubbed his forehead. "If that's true, then this isn't just about silencing a verdict. It's about silencing the system." Another agent returned from the hallway, breath clipped, voice tight. "We pulled the logs. Someone accessed the secured level 30 minutes before the courtroom doors opened. The badge ID came up as inactive, but it still unlocked the door." Blake's eyes narrowed. "That badge fragment, if Diesel's reacting to it, whoever carried it, had close proximity to him at some point. Could be a contractor, security, maybe even someone in uniform." The woman monitoring the playback rewound the footage again. "He's good, walked with purpose, knew the timing, didn't even flinch when the gallery started moving." Blake stood straighter. "That's not just planning, that's training." The room went silent for a moment. Then the agent closest to the door stepped out and returned with a folder. "We cross-referenced the camera angle with exit logs. There's one name that doesn't line up." He handed the file to the judge, who read it aloud. "Caleb Morrow, civilian tech consultant, cleared last year for data system support. Hasn't been active in 6 months, yet his badge pinged this morning." Diesel let out a short, low huff. Blake didn't wait. "Where is he now?" The agents moved fast, but not fast enough for Diesel. He paced to the door, pawed at it. Blake opened it and let him lead. Down the corridor, through the entryway. Diesel's nose hit the floor again. He turned left, then right. And then he stopped at a side exit, emergency only. Scratches marked the lock. Fresh. Outside, the light had faded. Blue dusk spilled across the parking lot, but Diesel didn't hesitate. He sniffed the air once, then growled again. The agent beside Blake pulled her radio. "We need to find Morrow, now." Inside, the courtroom remained locked down. Federal officers were pulling all files tied to the Turner case, double-checking everything, from witness lists to digital logs. It wasn't just about who planted the bomb. It was about what they were trying to erase. And for Blake, it was getting clearer by the hour that this went beyond his own trial. He turned back to Diesel, who had finally stopped growling, but still hadn't relaxed. "He's not finished yet," Blake said quietly. The agent beside him nodded. "Neither are we." The air in the courthouse had shifted. What once felt like sterile legal routine now pulsed with something darker, something deeper than procedure. Rumors snaked through the corridors, whispered between officers and clerks. Blake could feel it before anyone said a word. Diesel, too. The dog hadn't stopped pacing since they returned from the parking lot, his nose low, his gait stiff with purpose. He wasn't agitated, he was tracking. By noon, the news broke. Not to the public, not yet, but inside the building, where it mattered most. A member of the court's internal security staff had been quietly taken into custody. No sirens, no cuffs in the hallway, just a silent extraction by federal agents from a break room no bigger than a broom closet. The man's name, Officer Raymond Knox. Blake stood at the end of the corridor when he saw them lead Knox away. The man didn't resist, didn't speak, but as he passed, he glanced at Blake, not with fear, not even with malice, with contempt, a tight-lipped smirk, and a look that said he thought he'd gotten away with it. Diesel growled. They were taken to a sealed room in the basement of the building, away from cameras, away from ears. The agents had already begun pulling surveillance from Knox's access logs, dozens of off-hours entries, badge pings that had slipped under the radar, always near restricted evidence rooms, always during shifts where he volunteered to stay late. Blake sat stiff-backed across the table from the lead investigator. The woman's hands moved fast, flipping through pages of files now unsealed. She didn't look up when she spoke. Knox wasn't acting alone. He was the middleman. Just one spoke in the wheel. But he's the one who got the bomb inside. Blake's voice was quiet but sharp. Who paid him? The investigator paused, then slid a manila folder across the table. Inside, a logo, one Blake hadn't seen in years, a stylized eagle clutching two lightning bolts, Horizon Dynamics. His heart stopped cold. That name belonged to a defense contractor Blake had spent years investigating. The same company behind failed overseas missions. Civilian casualties swept under classified rugs. Budgets inflated, weapons misallocated, soldiers sent into chaos without backup. Blake had spoken out, too loudly some said. And when things turned political, when internal affairs got involved, the case vanished into red tape. No convictions, no justice. But it had cost him. Command had changed. His final deployment was reassigned under mysterious circumstances, and then came the first accusations. Diesel had been there through all of it. Blake ran his hand down the dog's spine, steadying his thoughts. The agent continued. Knox was getting regular deposits into a separate account tied to a shell company, Turngate Logistics, owned on paper by a man named Ellis. Grange. Blake didn't blink. Grange is Horizon's fixer. He cleans up their messes. Not this time, the woman said. We've issued a warrant. Outside, the courthouse remained sealed. Reporters pressed against the barricades like waves against a break wall, but inside, the silence was heavier than before. The judge hadn't reconvened the courtroom. Not yet. Too much was unraveling. In a separate room, Knox finally broke. After hours of interrogation, he admitted to placing the device under instructions passed through a third party. He claimed he didn't know it was live, just meant to scare, to disrupt proceedings, delay a verdict. A distraction, he insisted, not a murder plot. But no one believed him, especially not Blake. Because when men like Ellis Grange got involved, nothing was ever just for show. They didn't scare people, they erased them. It was supposed to look like a tragedy, a spontaneous disaster, one that would conveniently kill the man about to testify in his own defense, one that would destroy evidence, silence witnesses, reset the entire story. And it almost worked, if not for Diesel. Blake stood in the observation room, watching through the glass as federal agents boxed up files, bagged evidence, and logged chain of custody forms. Diesel sat beside him, calm now, quiet, his mission for the moment complete. Blake didn't speak until the investigator returned. "What happens next?" he asked. She looked at him with something close to respect. "We rebuild the case. Not just yours, all of it. Horizon, Grange, the money trail. This won't end in a courtroom. It'll end where it began, in the shadows they thought we'd never reach." Blake nodded slowly, then looked down at Diesel. They should have remembered who they were messing with. Because some warriors never stop fighting, and some dogs never forget. The courtroom felt colder than usual, not because of the air conditioning or the marble walls, but because everyone inside finally understood what could have happened. The verdict never came. There was no sentencing. Instead, there was silence, a silence that followed the withdrawal of all charges against Major Blake Turner. The judge's voice, usually full of authority, was unsteady when she spoke the final words. "Given the recent revelations and the credible threat uncovered by Mr. Turner's canine companion, this court finds there is insufficient evidence to proceed. All charges are dismissed." But there was no celebration, no applause, no sighs of relief, just stillness. Blake didn't move. He sat there, hands folded in front of him, Diesel resting against his boots. The dog didn't fidget, didn't bark, just breathed slow and steady, eyes trained ahead like a sentry. He wasn't here for applause either. He was here because he knew something wasn't right, and he had been right all along. Blake slowly stood, not to acknowledge the dismissal, but because his legs demanded motion. He'd been still too long, frozen by accusations, paralyzed by betrayal. Across the aisle, the prosecution bench was empty. Lyle Marks, the assistant district attorney, had vacated it days ago, pulled from the case once it became clear his office had been compromised. One of their own was part of it. The people sworn to uphold the law had tried to use the law as a weapon, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Blake's defense attorney stepped forward, her voice low as she leaned in. "You're not free, it's over." But Blake knew it wasn't. Not really. He nodded but didn't speak. Instead, he reached down and scratched behind Diesel's ears. "You did good, buddy," he whispered. Diesel tilted his head ever so slightly, the same way he used to on missions when Blake gave a quiet command in the dark. That same flicker of recognition, that same loyalty, unshaken. As they left the courtroom together, the hallway felt narrower than before. Cameras clicked in the distance. Reporters barked questions they didn't wait to hear the answers to. Blake ignored them all. He didn't owe them anything. Not now. Not after what he'd been put through. Outside, the sun stung his eyes. It was bright, almost unnaturally so after days inside that stone building. The first thing he noticed wasn't the heat or the light. It was the sound. Birds. A breeze cutting through the courtyard trees. Life. Things he hadn't allowed himself to notice when he was buried beneath suspicion. Diesel walked calmly at his side, not on a leash, but never straying. He didn't need to be led. He just knew where to go. They crossed the courthouse steps together. Behind them, agents were still inside, combing through files, collecting what was left of the case. The one meant to end Blake's life as he knew it. The one designed not to judge, but to disappear him. And yet, here he was. Not vindicated in the way TV dramas would show. No fist pumps or press conferences. Just quiet. A heavy, grounding quiet that came with knowing the system hadn't saved him. A dog had. They reached the truck parked along the curb. Blake opened the door and waited as Diesel jumped in, settling into the seat like he belonged there. Because he did. He always had. As Blake slid in beside him, he let out the first long exhale he'd taken in days, maybe weeks. "Home?" he asked. Diesel let out a soft huff, the closest thing to yes Blake would get, and it was enough. They drove in silence, the kind that doesn't demand conversation, the kind that wraps around you like a blanket after too many nights in the cold. Blake's thoughts were tangled. Anger, sadness, relief. But above all, there was one emotion he couldn't shake. Gratitude. For the dog who'd sat beside him through deployments and firestorms, who'd watched his back when humans didn't, who had stepped between him and a bomb, not for medals or headlines, but because that's what partners do. Back at his small home on the edge of town, Blake opened the door and watched Diesel step inside first. The dog walked to the middle of the living room and laid down like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like he had never left. Like the war, the trial, the betrayal, none of it could take away this moment. Blake followed, shutting the door softly behind them. No courtroom, no news crew, no spotlight. Just a man and a dog, still standing, still here. The courthouse doors swung open, and for a second, the light outside felt blinding. Blake stood still at the threshold, Diesel pressed close to his leg, their silhouettes framed against a sky that had never looked so open. The chaos outside waited for them. Reporters pressed against metal barricades, microphones extended like mock spears, camera flashes popping like gunfire. But Blake didn't flinch. He took a breath, deep and steady, then stepped forward into the noise. The moment he appeared, the questions came hard and fast. "Major Turner, were you aware of the threat before the bomb was found? Do you believe the attack was targeted at you personally? What will you do now that the charges have been dropped?" Blake ignored them all. His eyes weren't on the cameras, or the press, or the armed officers standing along the courthouse steps. His eyes were on the dog beside him. Diesel trotted calmly, head held high, unbothered by the crowd. His ears stayed alert, but he didn't pull, didn't panic, just kept his position like he always had, loyal, focused, ready. Blake reached the bottom of the steps, then stopped. The crowd shifted, trying to get closer. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the moment. But none of it mattered more than what he needed to do now. He turned to Diesel and knelt. The dog stopped, standing still, as if sensing the shift in gravity. Blake met his eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes that had seen war, that had once scanned foreign terrain for danger, that had watched over him while he slept in foxholes and guarded convoy routes through enemy territory. Those eyes had watched a courtroom that day, not with confusion or fear, but with certainty, instinct, and absolute purpose. Blake placed a hand gently on Diesel's neck, his fingers brushing the coarse fur behind the ears. "You saved them," he said, voice low, just for the dog. "You saved me." Diesel didn't move, just blinked slowly, exhaling through his nose like he understood every word. Blake's voice cracked as he continued. "They would have buried me, you know, the way they tried to bury the truth, but you wouldn't let them. You were the only one who didn't forget who I was." A few feet away, the media frenzy began to hush. People could see something was happening, something real, unscripted, a moment that didn't need a press release or a headline. Blake rested his forehead against Diesel's for a second, grounding himself. He remembered every deployment, every command, every unspoken signal between them. Remembered Diesel dragging him to safety after shrapnel tore through his side. Remembered the long nights with no one else but this dog and the desert wind. Remembered thinking he might not make it, and then looking into those eyes and knowing he had to, not because he wanted to survive, but because Diesel believed he would. When Blake finally stood again, the crowd was silent. Reporters lowered their microphones. Officers stopped shifting in place. Even the wind had gone still, like the world was listening. He placed a steady hand on Diesel's back, and they walked together down the sidewalk, not hurried, not hiding. Each step felt like reclaiming something that had been taken, not just his freedom, but his name, his integrity, his peace. A woman in the crowd wiped a tear from her cheek. A man lowered his phone and simply nodded. Across the street, a child pointed to Diesel and whispered, "That's the dog who saved everyone." And that was the truth. Because some heroes don't wear stars or robes or polished boots. Some don't speak at all. Some heroes are silent, steady, and built of muscle, instinct, and memory. Some heroes wear fur. Back at the truck, Blake opened the door, and Diesel hopped in with a kind of practiced ease. Blake paused before climbing into the driver's seat. He looked last time at the courthouse behind them, the place where truth was almost silenced. Almost, but not today, thanks to a dog who remembered. If this story moved you, if you believe loyalty, instinct, and quiet courage still matter in a world that forgets, don't forget to subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be told. And Diesel's, his story is only just beginning.